Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you all for joining us for this panel. Very excited to hear from Kingsmill and Yoni this morning. A super interesting subject that we're dealing with. Some of you may have seen the reports that these two have been working on over the last few months as they came out. We had a report from SYSTEMIQ that was very interesting in looking at not only the scope of kind of plastic pollution, especially in the oceans, but also doing some really fascinating detailed analysis of some of the solutions that we might bring to bear on this problem and the cost of those. I haven't really seen work at that level of detail before, so that was fascinating, and we're going to get to hear more about that. And then Kingsmill and Carbon Tracker picked up on that research and kind of took it a step further to look at what the plastic outlook looks like for the oil and gas industry, and trying to bring a little bit of a reality check to some of the assumptions that that industry is making about potential growth in that sector. And we're going to have a chance to hear some presentations from Yoni and from Kingsmill in just a second here. And then I'll be asking them some questions. And of course, we invite everyone who's listening to also ask questions. And you may see that in your Zoom box, by now I think we're all experts in using Zoom. There's a little button kind of in the bottom right part of the screen that says Q&A. If you click on that and drop your questions into there, I'll be looking at those and we'll have a chance to get those in as we go. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, was it Yoni that was going to go first? Yes, so I'll turn it over to Yoni from SYSTEMIQ, and we'll get to hear a little bit more about breaking the plastic wave. Very excited for that. So again, thanks everybody for joining, and here we go. I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, and welcome everyone. Hello. It's wonderful to be here today and to share the work with you. This project has been a baby of mine for the last 2.5 years, so I'm really thrilled to be able to share with all of you today. For me, this journey started in my first trip to Indonesia. I remember going to the beach and seeing it covered in plastic as far as the eye can see, 80 centimeters high. I remember the children playing on piles of rubbish, probably not even aware that there lies sand underneath. Many of you have been there and know exactly what I'm talking about. The awful sights, the smell of decay, the difficult conversations in people's homes. It was a really an out of this world experience, because these are communities that are threatened, these are jobs that are threatened, and these are people that are threatened. And at that point, you realize how far we have departed from nature's most basic design principles. And when I first realized through this work that we actually have the solutions today to deal with this challenge and to reduce plastic pollution by 80%, I was very motivated. And it's not something that would happen in 50 years or 100 years. It's something that could happen within our lifetime. By the time that my baby daughter is 20 years old, plastic pollution could be a thing of the past. That was a eureka moment for me, and I'm happy to share it with you today. So for us this project started, when we started this work, we were hearing the conversations, hearing the debate, hearing the solutions that were being proposed, and it felt like there were 5 unreconciled propositions of how to deal with plastic waste. Some people were saying just ban plastic altogether. Some people were saying just burn or bury plastic. Some people were saying we can clean up after the fact. Some people were saying we can just recycle it and we can build a recycling industry big enough, as large as the plastic industry. And some people were saying, let's just find biosolutions like compostables, biodegradables, or others in that family that will just make the problem disappear. The problem was that none of those strategies, it wasn't evident what are the environmental, economic, and social indicators behind each of those strategies. What costs and investments are required to bring them to fruition? How do the different solutions apply in different geographies, in different materials? And what is the timeline for implementation? So some really, really critical questions remained unanswered around these propositions. And that's exactly why we started on this journey, to try to uncover some of that information, try to bring data to this debate, to this narrative, and help decision makers make more informed decisions. And while people were discussing the different propositions, the tide of plastic kept rising. The work was published, in addition to Breaking the Plastic Wave report that many of you may have seen. This week, our work was published in Science. We were thrilled to appear in the cover of Science. So maybe some of you will have the opportunity to look at that already. And that was very important for us because it gives us the scientific credibility that we need in order to inform this debate. So that was a critical milestone for us, and we're very happy that it happened. Today I'm going to summarize the work along 4 critical questions that really summarize the work. Where are we headed? What's the way out? What will it cost? And what's the prize? So starting with where are we headed, you're probably guessing it, not to a great place under business as usual. So if you look at some of the key indicators under BAU, it's looking quite gruesome. When we look at municipal solid waste plastic, which is the plastic that we focused on for this project, which covers about 2/3 of total plastic, that we project will double over the next 20 years. We project that leakage or pollution to the ocean and to the environment broadly will roughly triple in that time frame, and the total stock in the ocean will more than quadruple in that time frame. So definitely a future that none of us want. We then looked at the current commitments that are taking place, because obviously many governments are acting, many companies are acting. We're seeing many commitments, and even if we assume that all of those commitments are implemented in full, which is a big if, we see the total reduction of leakage to the ocean relative to BAU is only 7%. So definitely the commitments are a great start, but definitely not enough to deal with the scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us. Even if you take a business perspective, an industry perspective, so we estimate that the total cost of waste management for the plastic, or at least the plastic that we focused on, by 2040 will be about $100 billion globally per year. And just to put that in context, that is 3 times more the profit of the same plastic today. So that clearly tells you, if governments turn around tomorrow and ask industry to pay for this bill, to pay for this externality, then the current business model that the industry relies on is simply not going to work. What's the way out? Let's start by looking at what's not the way out. So none of the silver bullets that are being proposed, we don't think are a way out. We saw that business as usual is clearly not the answer. We also saw that current commitments are clearly not the answer. But then we tested other scenarios that are being proposed. The first one is the recycling scenario. So this one assumes if we push recycling as ambitiously as we can possibly imagine, including scaling up collection globally, scaling up design for recycling, scaling up mechanical recycling, chemical recycling, really being as ambitious as we possibly can until we hit technical, economical, and political limits, then we think the scenario can definitely bend the curve on plastic, but it's not going to get us down to 0. It's going to flatten the curve at most. We then looked at the reduce and substitute scenario. So here we try to push reduction and substitution of plastic to the limits, using all the best technologies and solutions that are being proposed and really scaling them as far as possible until you hit real economical, climate, and other consumer acceptance limits like that. And again, similar story, you bend the curve, you don't get it down to 0. Lastly, we looked at what happens if we go all in for collection and disposal and try to collect all the plastic and dispose of it. How far do we get then? Similar answer, bend the curve, not get down to 0. It is only when we combined upstream and downstream solutions, so really scaling up upstream innovation, reduction, substitution, better design, with downstream solutions around collection and recycling and disposal, only when we combine those two that we created what we call the system change scenario. And that is really when you start seeing a significant decrease in plastic pollution. Even then, you don't get down to zero. But the good news is that with the current technology that we currently have, which is everything we modeled is existing technologies that we already have and already know how to use, you can get down to 82% reduction within economical constraints, within climate constraints, and within social constraints. And we think this is very, very good news. And this is a scenario, the system change scenario is the one that we will focus on today. So the system change scenario, what does it look like? You saw the bottom curve in terms of plastic leaking to the ocean. That is, of course, a subset of the overall mismanaged waste, because some of the waste, as you know, is burnt, some of it stays in the land. So in this scenario, we think this is the total amount of plastic that will be mismanaged in this best case scenario, if we apply all the solutions at the same time. What happens with the rest of the system? So we quantified what we call the reduce wedge. Everyone tells us we need to get rid of unnecessary plastic. Yes, I think we can all agree to that. But I think for the first time we've quantified how much that really is, and we've applied a detailed and methodology which I can share offline. But our conclusion from applying that is that 30% of the plastic could be reduced relative to business as usual. In terms of substitution, which is the next wedge, we think that 17% of plastic can be substituted to alternatives while taking into account unintended consequences such as carbon and other unintended consequences that could come from substitutes. We think that 17% of plastic could be substituted in ways that are net positive, all things considered. The next wedge is around recycle. So we say the recycling industry can and should massively grow and deal with a much bigger share of plastic than today. And the last wedge, which none of us like, but is unfortunately still necessary even in 2040, is the dispose wedge. So we're saying some amount of plastic that just we cannot reduce, we cannot substitute, we cannot recycle, and that amount of plastic we have to dispose of safely. So this together is kind of the system change scenario. One way to think about this is the top wedge, the purple one, reduce, is a way to provide utility to consumers in non-material ways. So this is your reusable bottle, providing packaging as a service. There's a lot of innovation in the space already, reducing over packaging. So basically getting consumers the utility they need without necessarily using material. That's the first wedge. The second wedge, substitute, is around providing utility in non-plastic ways. So we use material but not plastic. The third one is providing utility to consumers in non-virgin ways. So this does involve plastic, but it's not virgin plastic. And it's only the yellow and the red that is actually utility being provided through virgin plastic. And you can see the share of virgin plastic significantly decreases relative to today on the left by 2040. What will it cost? Of course, we don't want to offer solutions just for the sake of it. We need to make sure that they're grounded in realities of economics and social realities and consumer acceptance. So if you take a look at this picture, if you take a thin sliver of 2040 and you turn it by 90 degrees, we can then look at the cost of these different solutions. And what we find is some of these solutions are in the money today. So a negative cost here means anything that is below the line basically means a negative cost or a saving for the system. And we see that the reduction of plastic, so shifting to packaging as a service or elimination of plastic or reusable models, dispenser models, refill models, all these innovations, they come with a net saving to the system. Recycling, some of that is in the money, some of that is not yet in the money, and we need to make sure that we put the right policies in place and the right innovations in place to ensure that recycling is more and more in the money, especially in environments with low oil prices as we have now. Dispose is the next wedge. This one will never be, this one will always have a net cost, because this is basically putting plastic in a landfill or incineration, and there's no revenue streams coming out of that. So it's always going to be a net cost to society. And the last, substitute, which as far as we can tell in most places of the world is still more expensive than plastic. When we put that together and we look at the other dimensions, the bottom line of what we're saying is that the system change scenario is better for the economy, the environment, and communities. Let me pick that apart. The economy, we looked at the cost to governments, public sector cost under the system change scenario compared to the BAU, and we see a net saving of $70 billion by 2040 globally. This is driven a lot by the fact that we're getting rid of all the plastic that we don't need, which obviously reduces costs for collection, for sorting, for landfilling, and so on. But also the private sector cost goes down, because with the right recycling system in place and with the right economics in place, we are able to achieve some of these things in a much more economical way. The circular economy, at the end of the day, is meant to have better economics than today's system, where we're using single-use plastic and then disposing of it in the landfill. That is not an efficient way of providing utility to consumers. But also, if you look at the environment, of course, leakage to the ocean goes down significantly because that's what we were solving for. But also, if you look at greenhouse gases, those also go down 25%. Of course, not nearly enough to achieve the Paris Agreement, but this is still good news for us, because when we started this project, we were asking, what is the trade-off between cleaning the ocean and climate change? And what we find is that there is no trade-off. In fact, they go hand in hand, and you can do both at the same time. And then lastly, better for communities. Job creation goes up. This may not surprise you. Again, the circular economy is all about shifting from products to services, and those tend to be less capital intensive and more labor intensive. So from an employment perspective, they should be good. And especially when I think in the age of COVID, everyone asks, how can we build back better? When I look at this picture, when I look at this slide, this to me is exactly build back better, because we're talking about less cost to the public sector and the private sector, and therefore to consumers, better for the environment and for climate, and more employment. If this is not build back better, then I don't know what is. So what's the prize? We talked a bit about in the last slide how the system change scenario can reduce costs for government and for private sector, can decrease pollution of plastic, can decrease greenhouse gas emissions, can increase employment. But I want to take you back to the beach of Muncar for a second in Indonesia, where we have projects there, and we just cleaned a small part of the beach, maybe 200 or 300 meters of beach, and the children came running back, and children were children. And as a father, that made me realize that plastic pollution is not just taking away from these children the employment of their parents and tourism. Plastic pollution is taking away their childhood. And if nothing else, hopefully that alone is enough reason for us to act. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yoni. It's super fascinating, and we definitely have a lot of questions coming in that we will dive more into in a minute. But first, let's hear from Kingsmill about what this all kind of translates to for the oil and gas industry.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Yoni. My name is Kingsmill Bond. I have the pleasure of working for Carbon Tracker. And to summarize, this report that we did basically says it's a wake-up call to investors to save them from losing tens of billions of dollars in building stranded assets. In the same way as we've seen $90 billion of write-downs in the oil sector in the last 9 months, and $150 billion of write-downs in the electricity sector in Europe after its big peak point. The same thing is going to happen in this sector, and there's a lot of money that's going to be lost. So Carbon Tracker is a think tank that focuses on the implications of the energy transition for financial markets. One of our big observations is that the energy transition creates stranded assets because of the gap that emerges very quickly between the expectations of business, of incumbents for business as usual versus the reality of peaking demand. And as such, we're especially interested to focus on the plastics industry because it's here that of anywhere in the entire global energy system that there exists the largest gap between the expectations of incumbents and the reality of change. So as Yoni says, society wants change. There are technology solutions. Some politicians are acting. This is a story we have seen before many times, and it doesn't end well for investors. So our conclusion, as I say, is very stark. The oil and petrochemical sectors are betting their future on this growth in plastics demand, but that's not going to happen because of the war on plastics. And that means peak oil demand and $400 billion of stranded petrochemical capex. So I want to focus today on 6 issues, and I shan't be too long. First of all, what do incumbents expect? Just to lay out the sort of typical lazy thinking of incumbents about, it's all going to be the same in the future as it was in the past. And then what are the weaknesses in that argument? And I'll run through them quite quickly, but it's carbon, it's externalities, it's waste, it's saturation, it's leapfrogs, a lot of weaknesses in the argument. Then I want to revisit some of the technology solutions very quickly. Again, I shan't repeat what Yoni said, and then look at what politicians are actually doing. A number of the questions are coming through saying, well, okay, this is all great, but what's happening? We'll look at that, and then we'll conclude with, well, what's actually likely? And then what are the implications of all of this? So let's start with the rosy future that the plastics industry is kind of dreaming about. And you will note that the title is The Future's Not in Plastics, Benjamin, because this goes back to the famous film, The Graduate in 1967. In its most famous line, Maguire advises Benjamin there's a great future in plastics, and he was indeed right. Plastics demand at that time was 8 kilos per person, and today it's 46 kilograms. So it's been a great call, it's been a great run. And the problem is that the industry just can't get out of that mindset, and they think that the future is going to be the same as the past. And in the famous words of the 2020 Exxon Industry Day presentation, they say, we expect robust long-term demand growth for key chemical products with growth of 4% a year, 1% higher than GDP. If that happens, you get a doubling every 20 years, roughly. And as a result of that, capacity is being expanded very, very rapidly. The story's been supercharged by some other factors, the rise of low-cost ethane from US shale, the fact that the oil industry's got nowhere else to put its money right now, not too many areas of demand, the desire of owners of oil assets in the petro states to so-called diversify, and the standard story of Chinese capacity expansion. So as a result of all that, you see in this little chart, massive expansion of ethylene and propylene capacity, those being the 2 principal intermediary chemicals in the production of plastics. They are building out between 15 and 20 million new tons every year. We'll see how important that is in a moment. New facilities are being planned, built all over the world. So for example, Bloomberg New Energy Finance has identified planned new capacity of 81 million tons of capacity in the next 5 years. That's 81 million tons in the next 5 years, 40% in China, 20% North America, and then in the rest of Asia and various other locations. So what's then interesting about this very rapid expansion of plastics capacity is that it's actually driving all of the oil demand in the petrochemical sector. And we took in this report BP numbers, for example, from their 2019 outlook. All of the expected growth in oil demand from petrochemicals comes from plastic. The 2020 outlook came out after our report was released. It's the same story. In fact, they've reduced their oil demand growth, but all of the oil demand growth for petrochemicals is coming from plastic. So it's super important for the petrochemical sector. And then it's also super important actually for the entire oil sector. And I'll run through this in a little bit of detail because it's moderately interesting. So all of the other drivers of expected oil demand growth have been falling away over the last few years. So flying's being challenged by COVID and driving by the rise of electric vehicles. And plastics, as a result of that, has emerged as the largest expected driver of total oil demand growth in the kind of standard forecasts of people like the IEA and BP. So if I take the IEA data, which we played with a little bit, it's bigger than trucks, it's bigger than aviation, it's the largest area, it's about half of expected oil demand growth. And again, we'll scoot on past the BP numbers. It was basically all of the demand growth, and now they're expecting oil demand to fall. So clearly, plastics is one of the very few areas of expected demand growth. So that's what the incumbents believe and hope in. Let me just run through now briefly the sort of 5 or 6 reasons why we question this, this rosy view. So the first is carbon. So in broad terms, it's an industry which is extremely prone to disruption, easily disrupted. So the average ton of plastics responsible for about 5 tons of carbon dioxide emissions from the various stages of oil extraction, conversion, and then end-of-life disposal. And the sector as a whole, therefore, is emitting about a little bit less than 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That's about 5% of the global total. But the point simply is, if you expect to double over the next 20 years or so, and the rest of the world's going to get its carbon footprint to anywhere near Paris, which means somewhere near zero, you can see, as we show in this chart, there's a massive disconnect. And you don't have to believe that the whole of the world's going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement to recognize that there's going to be increasing pressure upon this industry to curtail its production, its carbon footprint. That's the first failing. The second one, again, Yoni's touched on this, but we played a little bit with the maths of the costs of the externalities per ton. I shan't run through it in excruciating detail, but there's basically 4 primary areas of externality. Each of them can be costed with varying degrees of accuracy, which is why we've got a low and a high cost framework. You've got carbon dioxide, 5 tons at $50 a ton, $250 a ton. You've got health, about the same order of magnitude. You've got collection and sorting, which breaking the plastic waste calculation suggests is closer to another $250 a ton. And then, of course, you've got ocean plastics. And we put in a fairly low number here from UNEP, which works out between $50 and $100 per ton. There are other calculations which suggest it's considerably higher. But we wanted to be moderately conservative. Anyway, the point simply is we get to an externality cost that every ton of plastics produced inflicts upon society of between $800 and $1,400 a ton. And the point to me is that people are paying this. They're paying it with their livelihoods. They're paying it with their health. They're paying with the pickup costs. They're paying with it with the damage that it's causing. These are real costs. They're not costs which, they're not theoretical costs. And incredibly, the industry doesn't pay for these externality costs at all. So if you add up all of the extended producer responsibility schemes in the world, they will come to less than the value of the subsidy of the oil used in plastic manufacturing. So anyway, second weakness, externalities. The third is the extraordinary waste. Again, I suspect we all know these, but just to run through the 3 key stats, 36% of plastics is single use. So it's used once and then thrown away to last for 10,000 years in a dump. There are very few restrictions on the use of plastics. In many countries, you can do what you like. 40% of plastics ends up in the environment, and less than 10% of plastics is really recycled. So you might think you're recycling, but the industry has been sufficiently flabby and lazy to mean that actually the stuff is not really recycled. So there's a lot of waste. And then the fourth point is that society's basically had enough. This waste, these costs, if you look at polls right across the world, 70 to 80% of people want radical action to reduce the use of single-use plastics. And then you have the old story of, which we see right across the energy complex, of developed market stagnation in demand, which you see here illustrated in Europe. Basically, demand has not regained its 2008 peaks for plastics in Europe. And the emerging market leapfrog as emerging markets, which also don't like plastic waste, find new solutions. And as we'll see later, countries like China are taking very radical action against plastic waste. So it's a developed market stagnation, emerging market leapfrog, something we've seen in coal, in cars, and in both instances, it created a very quick peak. And then the final point, it's a very technical one, but the BAU perspective is one where they are looking for growth in oil to come from plastics, but actually it's not even oil at all, it's NGLs. So the point I guess is that there's no support actually for oil demand from plastics. Okay, moving on to the third part of this brief presentation. As I said, I shan't repeat what Yoni said. There are obviously technology solutions. They come through at a lower cost. The virgin production, the total amount being spent on virgin production, total amount being spent in total is lower in the kind of solutions that SYSTEMIQ's coming up with. And then I want to focus for a moment on again, what's meat and drink to us at Carbon Track is charts like this. The gap that opens up between change and business as usual. So if the solutions suggested in Blakey plastic wave are actually implemented, you're going to have a very quick peak and then a decline, and that's set against this very rapid expectation of growth that the industry is anticipating. Okay, let me now move on to the fourth section. What are the political solutions? Because technology is fine, but we need to think about the likelihood of action. So I want to run briefly through the why and the how and the what of political change. So the first point is, why would politicians act? And I should say here, politicians outside the current federal government in the United States. Why should they act? Well, first of all, it's popular, as we've seen. Secondly, don't forget, plastics are just imported oil, and 80% of the world imports oil, or 83% of the world, in fact, imports oil, and wants to reduce dependency. And then thirdly, it's not going to cost very much. I mean, this is, the average person globally uses 46 kilograms of plastic a year. Even if you put on $1,000 a ton tax onto plastics, that's $46 per person, $4 a month, or 1 cent for a sandwich. The sums at a personal level actually for paying for this are extremely low. The question often then is asked as, well, how can you do it? And actually be surprised at how many tools politicians have got. Comes back to the point I made earlier about how flabby the industry is. You know, you can do bans, you can do targets, you can do taxation, do regulation, you can do recycling, infrastructure. There's actually plenty of things that politicians can do in theory. So what is actually happening? Again, I shan't go into too much detail, but the two key points to remember is that as we saw in electricity back in 2008, and as we saw in cars in 2014, it's Europe that's taking the lead. And they are planning, as you know, to implement €800 per ton tax on non-recycled plastic waste. They're planning to put on very strict regulatory constraints on this flabby industry, and undoubtedly that will drive down demand in Europe. I suspect we will see a very similar series of policies coming out of China in light of President Xi's comments to the United Nations last week, and also in light of the general war in China against waste and against oil imports. And I should say there's a kind of pedestrian approach which says, let's look at known legislation, let's tot it all up, let's tot up all the bans on plastic straws and demonstrate that they don't add up very much. This is a very backward looking and as I say, pedestrian approach, because the reality is those are simply the start. And as you succeed in your policies in one country after another, then other countries will pick them up, because ultimately nobody likes plastic waste. So what's likely, I think, is that we will see ever more powerful attempts to curtail plastic usage. It's quite useful to think of the world in basically 3 blocks: the OECD, China, and the rest of the world. So OECD consumption per capita is over 100 kilograms. So the average person using almost twice their body weight every year in plastics. You know, it can't be that hard to find ways to curtail that. In China, it's close to 70 kilos, and the rest of the world is going to catch up. But it's going to be a similar story to what we've seen elsewhere. Falling demand in the OECD, probably flat in China, allowing some growth in the rest of the world, but definitely not what the plastic industry expects, which is 2% growth in the OECD, 4% growth every year in China, and 6% growth in the rest of the world. That's far too high. People often then say, well, okay, what's the impact of COVID? I present here some data from Wood Mackenzie. Yes, we're using more masks, but basically the point is, yes, we're using a lot more masks, but we're buying a lot less cars and textiles. And as a result of that, actually, plastics demand is been falling this year, is likely to be significantly lower in 2020 than it was in 2019. And that then sets me up, I guess, for the point that we really is meat and drink to us at a Carbon Tracker, which is, what are the implications of all this? So this is a kind of standard chart. You get peaking demand in red, incumbent actual sales in red, challenges, new technologies that Yoni's talking about coming through in blue. You get huge amounts of stranded assets, but it doesn't mean just stranded assets, it means low prices. And I urge you to look at what's happened to the ethylene price this year as an example of lower prices materializing as you get a big gap between supply and demand, and poor returns right across the system. What does this mean for the plastic sector? We think the story started to play out already in the plastic sector. So if you look at, for example, ethylene supply demand. Before the crisis, you basically got the two of them moving lockstep. And at the end of 2019, the world had about 18 million tons of overcapacity of ethylene. You then get a fall in demand in 2020. Supply keeps on coming through at 15 to 20 million tons across the complex, as I was saying earlier, and you're going to have significant amounts of overcapacity. If governments even start to implement some of the ideas that breaking the plastic wave is focusing on, then you're going to have very significant amounts of overcapacity for the foreseeable future in the plastics sector. And it also have very significant consequences for oil. So again, we're just playing a little bit here with some of the data, but even before COVID, the IEA was only expecting 1% oil demand growth a year. If you wipe out 8 million barrels of oil in 2020, which is the latest thinking, get a bounce back in 2021, and then lose or start to lose your greatest area of expected demand growth, you're not going to get back ever to 2019 levels. Final points, financial market exposure. There's a lot of stocks in this space. There's about $6,000 billion worth of market capitalization. There are 8 subsectors which are impacted by disruption across the plastics, petrochemical, and oil sectors. Performance has been obviously weak, but we would expect to see many more write-downs, many more examples of what Saudi Arabia did when Aramco curtailed its one of its plastic plants recently. So, what should analysts do? I think analysts now need to be factoring in much higher levels of tax and regulation. They need to be assuming much lower growth rates going forward, continued overcapacity and lower prices. They need to reduce their terminal values, work out where the stranded assets will be, and factor in cleanup costs. And the final slide here is, what should investors do? Well, we would suggest they should significantly reduce or continue to reduce their allocation to sectors facing disruption, short the stocks with the highest degree of exposure, go long short companies that are changing versus those which are just paying lip service, a strategy which has worked extremely well in other areas of the energy complex, pressurize companies to stop wasting capital on redundant new capacity, and then finally, and on a more hopeful note, invest in the innovators that are coming up with new solutions right across the technology chain. I will stop there and hand back to you. Thank you, Tim.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kingsmill. That is so much to unpack there. By the way, I think I realized that I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Tim McDonnell. I'm a reporter covering energy and climate at Quartz, which is a global business magazine. I'm based in Washington, DC. So thank you both so much for those presentations. Yeah, like I said, there's a lot to unpack there, and I see that we have a good number of questions from the audience, which I will certainly get to, but I had a few of my own that I wanted to get to first. One of them is, there's just this statistic that comes up in both of these reports that, you know, I think is kind of taking a step back from the kind of main focus, but one that I want to touch on because I just find it so shocking. Which is this, there's kind of two that go in tandem, that 40% of plastic waste winds up in the environment, and that also less than 10%, maybe something like 5% of all plastic is actually really recycled. And when I read these numbers, you know, it's almost like, I realize these are not new, this is kind of well known, but I find them so surprising because they just seem like such a huge failure. And I'm wondering if Yoni and Kingsmill, if I would direct this question maybe to both of you, if you have thoughts, if you could just sort of reflect on how we got to the point that we're at, and maybe why these numbers are so bad. I know that's a very broad question, and there's, you know, a lot of different ways to answer it, but I just think it's important to have some kind of context for the world that we're living in now. How did we wind up in this place? I would love to hear your kind of thoughts on that. And I can turn it over to, just for the sake of ease, maybe I'll turn it to Yoni first and then Kingsmill if you want to jump in.
Yoni, you're on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. Let me give that a shot. So indeed, the 40% number is a very difficult statistic, right? And I think many people in the global north, myself included before this project, don't realize that number, because obviously in the global north, we don't have those levels, but we don't realize that on a global level, there's just so many people in the world that don't have collection services, and they don't have a choice but to either burn their plastic or put it in the waterways or in the land, right? And I think to your question, how did we get here? In the global north, as the plastic was growing, and we saw the numbers from Kingsmill, how quickly it grew, the waste management sector was growing at the same time, and it happened in a much slower speed relative to what we're seeing in countries in Southeast Asia, in Asia generally, in Africa. The speed is just so fast, it's just overwhelming the system. And governments are not able to cope with that growth and are not able to build infrastructure fast enough. But by no means, I don't want to give the message that kind of pointing the finger to those countries, because 85% of the companies who design these plastics and sell it into these markets, 85% of those companies have headquarters either in North America or in Europe. So the design of these plastics, kind of designing plastics that have no value after use, single-use plastic, all of that is happening actually in the global north. And therefore, it's those companies and those governments that have massive responsibility. I just want to give you one number that I find so shocking when I think about the collection figures, which is there are currently 2 billion people in the world without collection services, 2 billion. And the global population will grow by 1.7 billion people in the next 20 years. So by 2040, if we want to close the collection gap, we need to connect 3.7 billion people to collection. And just to get a sense of what that number means, if you divide that number by the number of days left from now to 2040, you quickly find that we need to connect over 500,000 people every single day, every day of the week from now to 2040. 500,000 people every single day. That's the size of that's the scale of the challenge that we're talking about. And that's the reason why we're saying the only way to get out of this mess is to reduce the amount of plastic in the system. And that's why I talked about that and Kingsmill talked about that we're never going to solve it just through collection and recycling. The scale of the challenge is just way too big.
Thanks. Kingsmill, you want to add anything?
Well, just to focus on this point about less than 10% being really recycled, I think a lot of people would be a little bit shocked by that statistic. I mean, the number I think a lot of people have in their heads are that, you know, about 20% of plastics get picked up and surely that gets recycled. But the problem is that because the industry has allowed lots of products to be produced which can't actually be recycled, you put it in your recycling bin and then it doesn't get recycled. It gets sent to the recycling sector and then rejected and then burnt or buried. And actually there's an extremely simple solution to this, and that's what the European Union is putting forward. They're saying to all plastics producers, after 2030 you can't produce single-use plastics if it can't be recycled. I mean, this is not a very difficult thing for legislators to do, and this is one of the many reasons why I think there's a huge amount of very low-hanging fruit that politicians can start to put into place to at least stop the growth in demand. I mean, it's going to be very, very hard to, and no one's suggesting that we're going to stop using plastic completely, but just to stop the growth by putting in place some fairly sensible regulatory structures is considerably easier.
That's great. One thing I wanted to ask you too, Kingsmill, was so one of the things we've been watching over the last few months, obviously as the pandemic has unfolded, is an unprecedented drop in oil prices. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that kind of market dynamic and whether the kind of oil price crash that we've seen has, you know, improved the sort of financial conditions for some of the petrochemical facility investments that we've been seeing, or what the connection is kind of between the oil price, which may remain low for, you know, the next few years, possibly much longer, and you know, the outlook for some of these facilities.
Sure. I mean, I think, as you know, the collapse in oil prices has dealt a very nasty blow to the recycling industry in the short term, because what's happened is the price of virgin materials got even lower, and it's just made it much harder for the recycling industry to operate. This then is actually precisely why we would suggest governments need to get involved, because if people accept that there's a real externality cost from the production of virgin plastic, and now that the costs of oil are lower, that's precisely the moment that governments now should be stepping in and implementing tax wedges in order to make sure that the virgin plastic pays its way and actually pays for these externality costs. So it's messy is the answer to that one. I mean, there are certain countries where there's enormous institutional resistance to doing that. That there are other countries like Europe and China where I think it's going to happen.
And just to build on that, so I fully agree with everything Kingsmill said. Just to say, plastic today has a massive advantage. Some would say, myself included, an unfair advantage, right? First of all, plastic benefits from billions and billions of dollars of subsidy to the oil and gas industry that indirectly benefit plastic relative to recycled plastic or relative to other substitutes. And plastic is also an industry that's been around for, since 1950s, and it's been scaling massively. So it's very difficult for alternatives to compete, very difficult for other products to compete, even though it is in society's interest, because those have much lower externalities, as Kingsmill was talking about. So yeah, I fully agree with that. It's in all of our interest kind of to make sure that the price signals in the market reflect the real cost of these materials, and plastic right now are having an unfair advantage in that regard.
Yep, that's a great point. Another thing I wanted to ask you guys about was, I'm sure many of us have read, there was a great article in the New York Times last month looking at the efforts by some trade groups to roll back some of the bans on single-use plastic in African countries. And, I know there was also a question from one of our audience members about the role of petrochemical lobbyists. I'm wondering, Kingsmill or Yoni, whoever wants to take this, if you can talk about kind of the impact of that lobbying pressure, and I guess, more specifically, to what extent the industry's assumed growth rate in the future is sort of based on an assumption that it will succeed in forcing open some new markets for virgin plastic, or at least finding new places to dump waste. Can we just kind of talk about that, the sort of lobbying influence here a little bit?
Shall I talk about the assumed growth? I don't know if you want to talk about the lobbying story, Yoni. So, I mean, just to be clear, you can divide the world into three, as I say, three different groups: OECD, China, and the Global South, and or the emerging markets, as I call it, with my financial background. And basically, almost all of the growth actually is expected to come up from outside the OECD by most forecasters. So, the growth of this industry depends upon continue to increase growth in non-OECD markets. And look, I think the lobbying industry does what it does. The problem they face is that because the industry is increasingly losing its social license to operate, because they've been so successful for so long at ignoring the legitimate concerns of the rest of society. They can do this, but it gets harder and harder, and it makes the whole industry more and more fragile the further they get away from the hopes and aspirations of the rest of the world. And sorry, to conclude, one final point, as I mentioned earlier, but don't forget that plastic's the same as oil, right? And if most countries are now trying to curtail their oil demand, for strategic and geopolitical reasons, particularly China and India. And if you can reduce your plastics demand, then you're going to reduce your effective oil demand as well. So there are very good reasons for countries to curtail their plastics demand quite beyond the quite beyond the issue of waste. And yeah, anyway, I don't know, Yoni, if you'd like to.
Yeah. Just a word on lobbyists. So we haven't analyzed lobbyists in particular, but undoubtedly kind of lobbyists are successful, and that's why they do what they do, and that's why they get paid for what they do, right? But I don't think necessarily lobbyists are a bad thing, because there's lobbyists on every side of the agenda. So I would focus on kind of the underlying agenda and the future of plastics. And what I would say is there's just so much pressure on the plastic industry. This is pressure not just from consumers and civil society and NGOs, but also real pressures from investors, so from shareholders who are asking plastic companies very difficult questions, and also all the big brands and the retailers, they're asking a lot of questions, and they're thinking, all of them, kind of, we work with them, we know them. I'm sure people in the audience do as well. Maybe some of you work for those companies. Those companies understand the risk, and they're looking for solutions to shift away from plastic, certainly from virgin plastic. So it's less a question of kind of how successful the lobbyists will be. That may be in the short term, but in the long term, I think it's clear that consumer pressures are there to stay. Shareholder pressures are there to stay. And I think even employees in these companies are asking questions. Today it's difficult to recruit millennials to these companies. So I think it's kind of, if you take a long-term perspective, I think it's only going in one direction.
Great. So just to shift gears a little bit, I wanted to jump over to some of our audience questions. We have one here that I think is interesting. What are your thoughts on bioplastics as part of the plastic waste solution? Would they be hard to integrate into the end of life management? Maybe Yoni, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. Such a complex topic. It's hard to do it justice in 2 minutes, but I'll do my best. First of all, when people say bioplastics, there's just a very messy definitions, and there's many different, some people are talking about biodegradable, which means what happens after you use it, and some people are talking about bio-based, meaning it came from biological sources. And those are two completely different groups with very different solutions. And they get lumped into this thing called bioplastics, but we should differentiate those two things. I think in general, there is a role for, we prefer the term compostables, but there is a role for compostables to play. We don't think it's a silver bullet, and we don't think it's going to solve all of our problems, because it requires very expensive infrastructure, and it has its own issues. But there definitely are some applications and some geographies where compostables are definitely ready, and they definitely have a role to play in terms of substituting plastic. Sorry to keep it a bit high level. There's a lot more detail in our report, specifically going into compostables, or I'm happy to take it offline with whoever asked the question.
Thanks. I have there's another question here. What's your, and this is maybe one for Kingsmill, I don't know. What's your suggestion for getting rid of inefficient old plants? Retrofitting old plants could be costly for meeting decarbonization goals. I think this kind of gets to something I was also interested in, which is, you know, we've talked about various solutions here. I was hoping we could kind of drill down a little bit into the kind of carbon intensity issue specifically, which is a big problem on top of the waste and the other problems that we've talked about. Kingsmill, can you say anything about, you know, what we might do to kind of bring down the carbon intensity of plastics, and whether, you know, there's a way to, whether, you know, retrofitting old plants or some other kind of improvement in infrastructure is on the table, or if that, how that kind of fits in?
Thanks, Tim. Look, I think unlike in many other sectors where there's an outright rapid decline in demand, which is coming, which is why you've already had to start to close down gas and coal plants across the world. We're not seeing a rapid decline in demand of the plastics industry in the near future. So you don't have a huge need to close down plants immediately. I think it's a separate question. What would you do with plants which have got very high carbon intensity? And I think the ball's now in the court of the plastics industry to find out solutions, because undoubtedly there's going to be increasing pressure to start taxing carbon, not just in the plastics industry, but right across the board. And this happens to be the industry, again, where it's particularly obvious that they're going to be more aggressively singled out by governments. And they are going to have to figure out solutions in the same way as other industries are doing. I was on a call earlier this morning, actually, where all of the oil producers are trying to work out ways of getting oil out of the ground with less carbon. The same thing applies here as well. I don't know, Yoni, if you've seen the answer. I haven't yet.
Yeah, nothing to add on that.
Let's see here. There's so many good questions. It is hard to choose one. I'm just trying to scroll through them quickly. I think we've managed to answer. Some people are asking similar questions to one another. Kingsmill, do you think, here's a question. I think this was mentioned in one of the presentations. This 800 euro per ton is the 800 euro per ton EU tax enough to offset the drop in oil prices, enough to encourage recycling and reduce demand? Can we talk about the economics there a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, 800 euros per ton is, let me see, that's going to be about 100 euros a barrel. So that's definitely more than enough to offset any fall in oil prices. I think one question, so you didn't answer, sorry, didn't ask, but it is also possibly implicit in that, is that don't forget this is 800 euro per ton on non-recycled plastic waste. And how about all the rest of the plastics? This is why, as I say, I think we need to recognize that the kind of legislative push that we're starting to see now from Europe and its incipient stages in China is the start. There will be a lot more. So we start taxing the non-recycled plastic waste in Europe and give it a few years, and it's highly likely we'll be taxing all plastic production. So that I suspect is the future, higher levels of taxes right across the board.
Great. There was one question, there was another question here on, another kind of policy question that maybe both of you would have thoughts on. Someone is asking, what's your take on the deposit scheme system for plasticware and packaging?
Yeah, I can give it a shot. Many places where the deposit system was used, it was very effective. It's especially effective when governments work together with industry to come up with a system that basically there's a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. There have been many DRS systems where the private sector try to do it on their own without government support. And while that can happen, it's just much more difficult to get a standard that all companies agree to, which is the critical factor for DRS to work. When it's done together with government, then it's been quite successful. Many places of the world, Brazil has a good system. Some countries in Europe, Germany is well known, and some others as well. So that can definitely be part of the solution.
Great. And I think we're just about to run out of time, but I'll squeeze one more question in here because this one just came in under the wire and I think it's interesting for Yoni maybe. Just thinking about the potential other environmental problems that might arise from substitution. Where, if we're talking about paper or coated paper, compostables, other things, do you account for deforestation or water use or other sorts of impacts that may arise from that kind of source switching?
Yeah, excellent question. We get that all the time. Kind of what are the unintended consequences of these substitutions? And it's of course critical to look at that and make sure we're not substituting plastic with something that may be worse, depending on the application, depending on the geography, which is why our work went into great depth and looked kind of application by application for 15 different types, geography by geography, where are the places that it makes sense for which substitutes and where does it not make sense, depending on where does it come from, what is the recyclability, what is the compostability, what is the cost, and so on and so on. The reason that we came with a substitute wedge of 17% and not 70% or 100% is because we say exactly substitutions have limitations. And in fact, when we looked at glass and aluminum and others, we do not think they're good substitutes as single use. So metal could be a great multi-use, reusable bottle with metal is fine, but as a single use, we don't think that aluminum and glass are good substitutes for plastic, which is why we left them off. Paper and compostables, we think that there are applications and there are parts of the world where it could work. Of course, the first requirement is that it's sustainably sourced forestry, which is why that wedge is predominantly in the global north, where there are more kind of well-managed forests. In the global south, we see a much smaller wedge for substitutes. So yes, it's something we accounted for, but it has to be done on a case-by-case basis.
Great. Well, I think that pretty much brings us up to time. So I want to thank Kingsmill and Yoni very much again for your presentations and for all of your really insightful thoughts here, and also for all of our wonderful audience members who asked questions and who were standing by. Many people were asking to if the slides will be available, and I believe they will be, so stay tuned for that. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of Climate Week, and take care.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.